They say no good deed goes unpunished, but I'm here to tell you that ain't always true. Sometimes the good Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he sends help on four legs with a tail that won't quit wagging. My name's Samuel Whitmore, and at 78 years old, I've got a story that's been eating at me like rust on an old Chevy. I need to get this off my chest before I meet my maker. Because what happened 4 years ago on Miller's Creek Road changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, forgiveness, and what it means to be family. See, there was this German shepherd we called Major, big as a house and twice as smart. That old boy taught this old dog about the kind of love that don't ask questions, don't keep score, and sure as hell don't give up when the going gets tough. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I made a terrible mistake that nearly cost me everything. And it took a fire, a miracle, and one stubborn dog to show me the truth. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. It was a Saturday morning in late September, 4 years back, when the whole thing started. The kind of crisp autumn day that makes you grateful to be alive, with leaves turning gold and the air smelling like wood smoke and possibility. My granddaughter Becky was visiting from college, 20 years old then, studying to be a veterinarian like she'd dreamed since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. "Come on, Grandpa Sam," she'd said, bouncing around our kitchen like a jackrabbit. "Let's go to Crystal Lake. The fish are practically jumping into the boat this time of year." My wife Dot was packing our tackle box, humming some old hymn under her breath the way she did when she was content. We'd been making this trip to Crystal Lake for near on 40 years, ever since we moved to Copper Ridge. It was our tradition, our little slice of heaven. We were driving down Miller's Creek Road in my old pickup, windows down, Becky chattering about her veterinary classes, when I had to slam on the brakes so hard our fishing poles rattled in the truck bed. There, sprawled across the gravel shoulder like a broken toy, was the biggest German shepherd I'd ever laid eyes on. At first glance, I thought he was a goner, lying so still, covered in dust and blood, looking like he'd been hit by something moving fast and mean. But then I saw his chest rise and fall, just barely, like he was holding on to life by a thread and a prayer. "Oh, my Lord," Dot whispered, her hand flying to her throat the way it did when she was shaken. Becky was already unbuckling her seatbelt before I could stop her. "Grandpa, we can't leave him here to die." The dog was in terrible shape. His beautiful black and tan coat was matted with blood, and his left hind leg was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. But it was his eyes that got me, deep brown eyes that seemed to look right through you, filled with pain but also something else. Intelligence, dignity, like he was a soldier who'd taken a hit but wasn't ready to surrender. "Must have been a hit and run," I said, kneeling beside him. He was clearly a purebred, probably around 2 years old, with the strong build and noble bearing you see in police dogs or military working dogs. Even hurt as he was, there was something regal about him. Something about this dog reminded me of the boys I served with in Vietnam, that look in their eyes when they were down but not out. "We have to help him," Becky said, already stroking his massive head with gentle hands. "Look at his eyes, Grandpa. He's fighting to live." That's when I made the decision that would change all our lives forever. Getting that dog to Dr. Harrison's clinic was like transporting wounded cargo, delicate, urgent, and heartbreaking all at once. I lifted him as carefully as I could, all 90 pounds of him, and laid him on the old army blanket we kept in the truck bed. Becky climbed right in beside him. cradling his big head in her lap, whispering reassurances the whole 20-mile drive back to town. "You're going to be okay, boy," she kept saying, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We're going to take care of you." Dr. Bill Harrison had been treating animals in Copper Ridge for over 30 years, and I'd never seen him look as grim as he did when we carried that dog through his clinic doors. After what felt like the longest examination of my life, he pulled off his glasses and shook his graying head. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, folks," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of bad news. "This dog has a shattered femur, internal bleeding, and what appears to be a severe concussion. The surgery alone will run you close to $8,000, and even then—" He paused, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. "Even then, he might not make it through the night." Dot's face went pale. "Sam, we're on a fixed income, $8,000. But before I could answer, Becky looked up at us with those determined eyes she'd inherited from her grandmother. "Please, Grandpa, please don't let him die because of money." Something in that dog's eyes reminded me of the wounded soldiers I'd seen in field hospitals 40 years ago. That quiet courage in the face of overwhelming odds. I looked at my wife, and she nodded, though I could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. "Do what you have to do, Doc," I said. "Money's just paper. Life's what matters." The surgery took 6 hours. 6 hours of pacing the waiting room, drinking stale coffee, and watching Becky pray over a dog she'd known for all of 3 hours. When Dr. Harrison finally emerged, exhaustion etched across his weathered face. His first words were music to our ears. "He made it through surgery," he said, and Becky let out a whoop that probably woke half the county. "But he's not out of the woods yet. Next 48 hours will tell the tale." We visited that dog every day during his recovery. Becky would sit by his kennel, reading to him from her veterinary textbooks, talking to him like he was an old friend. Dot smuggled in homemade beef jerky against Dr. Harrison's orders, claiming that store-bought food never healed anybody properly. But it was during those visits that I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. When I'd speak, the dog would cock his head in a way that seemed familiar, almost like he was listening to commands. When I unconsciously stood at attention during the evening news, old military habit, he'd sit up straight as a flagpole, ears forward, eyes alert. "That's odd," Dr. Harrison mentioned one afternoon. "Most dogs his age, especially after trauma, they're skittish around men, but he seems to respond to you specifically, Sam." One day, out of curiosity more than anything else, I gave him a basic hand signal I remembered from my Army days, the closed fist that means stay. That dog froze like he'd been turned to stone, eyes locked on mine, waiting for the next command. "Well, I'll be damned," I muttered under my breath. "Language." "Samuel Whitmore," Dot scolded, but she was staring at the dog too. After 2 weeks in the clinic, we brought him home. Becky had already named him Major, claiming he carried himself like he could lead an army. Our house, which had felt quiet since our kids moved away and Becky started college, suddenly came alive with the sound of his gentle footsteps and soft whimpers. But as much as Major seemed to appreciate our care, there was something distant about him. He'd accept food and gentle pets, but he never fully relaxed. It was like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for us to hurt him or abandon him like others had done before. The way he'd flinch at sudden movements, how he'd cower if voices were raised. Someone had hurt this boy badly before that accident. "He's been through hell," Dr. Harrison told us privately. "Dogs don't forget trauma any easier than people do. He's going to need patience and understanding to trust again." That's when the Petersons came into the picture. Michael and Sarah Peterson lived on a farm outside town with their 12-year-old twins, Jake and Lucy. They'd recently lost their beloved German Shepherd to old age and heard through the church grapevine about our situation. "We'd love to give him a home," Sarah said when they visited. "The kids have been heartbroken since we lost Duke, and we've got 20 acres for him to run." I watched Major with those children, saw how his tail wagged just a little when they spoke softly to him, how he seemed more at ease with their young energy. The practical part of my brain knew they were right. A dog like Major needed space, needed a family with the time and energy to help him heal properly. But watching him try to follow our car when we left him at the Peterson farm was like watching my heart drive away. In my rearview mirror, I could see him limping after us, trying to keep up. That noble head held high despite his confusion and fear. "We did the right thing," Dot kept saying, though her voice was shaky. "He needs a younger family, Sam. We're too old to give him what he needs." I told myself the same thing, but every night for weeks I'd lie awake thinking about those brown eyes watching our truck disappear down their driveway. For the next 3 years, we'd get updates about Major through Dr. Harrison and occasional sightings around town. He'd grown into a magnificent dog, the Petersons reported, his coat glossy, his demeanor more confident. The slight limp from his injured leg was barely noticeable, and he was an excellent guardian for their children and livestock. "He's doing real well," Michael Peterson would tell me when we'd run into each other at the hardware store. "Great with the kids, protective but gentle. You folks did a fine thing saving him." But there were other reports, too, ones that puzzled everyone involved. Major had a habit of showing up at our house, sometimes at night, sometimes during the day. He'd just appear in our yard, lying quietly by the front porch, never causing trouble, never demanding attention, just watching. The Petersons would come collect him, apologetic and confused. "We don't understand it," Sarah would say. "Our fence is secure, and he's never been an escape artist. It's like he just knows how to find his way here." During one of these visits, I noticed something that should have set off alarm bells in my head. Major kept sniffing around Dot, following her from room to room, whimpering softly whenever she coughed. At the time, I chalked it up to him missing us, maybe picking up on some scent that reminded him of his recovery time here. "He's just homesick," I told myself, and anyone who'd listen. Dogs got long memories. But Dot's cough was getting worse, and she was losing weight. When I'd suggest she see a doctor, she'd wave me off with that stubborn streak that had kept her going through 50 years of marriage, 3 kids, and more challenges than any one woman should face. "It's just a cold that won't quit," she'd say. "Nothing that rest and chicken soup won't cure." Looking back now, I realized that Major was trying to tell us something important. That highly trained nose of his was picking up on changes in Dot's scent, changes that would take doctors with fancy machines months to detect. But I was too proud, too scared, and too damn stubborn to listen to a dog. That was my first mistake, and it nearly cost me everything. Now comes the part of this story that shames me to my core. The confession that's been eating at me like a cancer for 3 years running. I lied to my wife about something that could have killed her. And I did it because I was the biggest coward this side of the Mississippi River. You see, about a year after we gave Major to the Petersons, Dot started showing signs that something wasn't right. At first, it was just little things, a cough that hung on longer than it should, getting winded walking up the stairs, losing her appetite for my famous Sunday pancakes. But as the months wore on, those little things started adding up to something that scared the hell out of me. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, coughing fits that would shake the whole bed. I'd find tissues with spots of blood in the wastebasket, though she tried to hide them underneath other trash. Her clothes started hanging loose on her frame, and those bright eyes that had captured my heart 50 years ago began to look tired. So damn tired. But here's the thing that makes me a fool and a coward both. I knew something was wrong, and I pretended I didn't. Every time she'd catch me looking at her with worry, I'd force a smile and change the subject. When she'd mention maybe seeing Dr. Patterson about that persistent cough, I'd say something like, "Ah, it's just the dry air. Dot, nothing a humidifier won't fix." Why did I do such a terrible thing? Because I was terrified. Terrified of losing the woman who'd stood by me through Vietnam nightmares, through lean years when work was scarce, through the death of our youngest son in that car accident 20 years back. The thought of facing life without Dorothy Whitmore was more than this old soldier could bear. So I stuck my head in the sand like an ostrich and pretended everything was fine. But Major knew. Damn that dog. He knew before any of us. Those visits to our house became more frequent, more urgent. He'd show up at all hours. And instead of just lying quietly on the porch like before, he'd pace around Dot like a sentry on duty. He'd nudge her hand with his massive head, whimper when she coughed, and position himself between her and anyone else in the room like he was protecting something precious. That dog's acting mighty strange, I'd tell the Petersons when they'd come to collect him for the 3rd time in a week. Maybe you should have Dr. Harrison take a look at him. But Michael Peterson would just shake his head. Doc says he's healthy as a horse, just seems drawn to your place for some reason. The reason was standing right there in her flowered house dress, coughing into a handkerchief and trying to pretend she wasn't getting sicker by the day. But I was too proud, too scared, and too wrapped up in my own fear to see what was right in front of my nose. One particular evening stands out in my memory like a neon sign. Dot was sitting in her rocking chair, the one her daddy made her for our 1st anniversary, working on a quilt for the church raffle. Major had shown up again that afternoon, and instead of calling the Petersons right away, I'd let him stay for supper. He positioned himself right beside Dot's chair, his big head resting on her knee, those intelligent brown eyes never leaving her face. Every time she'd cough, and the coughing was getting worse, he'd whimper and paw gently at her arm. "Sam," Dot said, her voice hoarse from another coughing fit. "This dog's acting like he's trying to tell us something." I should have listened. God Almighty. I should have listened to both of them. Instead, I said something stupid like, "Dogs don't talk, honey. He's just glad to see you." But that night, after we'd called the Petersons and Major had reluctantly left with them, I caught Dot standing at the bathroom sink, gripping the edges so tight her knuckles were white. In the mirror, I could see her face, pale as winter snow, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. "Dot," I said, stepping up behind her. "You feeling all right?" She looked at my reflection in that mirror, and for just a moment, I saw the truth in her eyes. She was scared, maybe as scared as I was, but she was waiting for me to be strong enough to face it with her. Instead, I chickened out. "You're probably just tired. Why don't you get some rest?" She nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her expression. "You're probably right." Sam. That night, I lay awake listening to her labored breathing, feeling like the worst kind of husband. Here was a woman who'd nursed me through pneumonia, who'd held my hand through nightmares about jungle warfare, who'd been my rock through every storm life had thrown at us. And when she needed me to be strong, I was failing her. The visits from Major became even more frequent after that. Sometimes he'd show up in the middle of the night, and I'd find him in the morning, lying on our front porch like a guardian angel with fur. Other times, he'd appear when Dot was hanging laundry or working in her garden, always staying close, always watching her with those worried eyes. I told myself that dog was just homesick, I said to Dr. Harrison one day when I ran into him at the post office. "Dogs got long memories, you know." Dr. Harrison gave me a look that cut right through my excuses. "Sam, in my experience, when an animal acts that persistent about something, there's usually a good reason. Maybe you should have Dot come in for a checkup." I nodded and mumbled something about thinking about it, but we both knew I wasn't going to follow through. I was too busy living in denial, too comfortable with my cowardice to face the truth that was staring me in the face every time Major showed up at our door. The truth is, I knew that dog was trying to save my wife's life, and I ignored him because I was afraid of what the doctors might find. I was so terrified of losing her that I was willing to let her get sicker rather than face the possibility of bad news. A man my age should know better than to lie to himself. But fear makes fools of us all, and by the time I finally found the courage to face the truth, it nearly cost me the most precious thing in my life. That dog was doing his job, and I was too stubborn and scared to listen. Sometimes the best soldiers are the ones who never give up, even when the people they're trying to protect are too damn foolish to accept help. Major never gave up on us, even when I gave up on myself. The truth about Major came out on a cold February morning when Dr. Harrison called me with news that knocked me sideways. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing my second cup of coffee and watching Dot struggle through another coughing fit. When the phone rang, "Sam," Dr. Harrison said, his voice carrying that tone doctors use when they've got something important to tell you. "I need you to come down to the clinic. There's something about Major you need to know." An hour later, I was sitting in his office while he pulled out a thick manila folder that looked like it had been through a war zone. The papers inside were military documents, official-looking forms with government seals and classification stamps. "Major's not just any German shepherd. Sam," Dr. Harrison said, spreading the documents across his desk. "His real name is Major Rex, and he's a retired military working dog. Served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division." I felt like I'd been sucker punched. "Military. More than that," Dr. Harrison continued, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. "He was specially trained in dual detection, explosives and medical alerts, IEDs, roadside bombs, but also cancer detection, diabetic episodes, seizures. This dog could smell disease better than most medical equipment we've got. The room started spinning around me like a carnival ride. Medical detection. According to his service record, Major had a 96% accuracy rate for detecting cancer in early stages, lung cancer specifically. Doctor, Harrison looked at me over his reading glasses. Sam, when was the last time Dot had a full medical workup? My throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of sand. She's been meaning to make an appointment. That dog's been trying to tell you something. Sam, all those visits, the way he hovers around Dot, the whimpering when she coughs. He's not being affectionate. He's giving you a medical alert. The folder contained Major's entire military history. His handler had been Sergeant Miguel Martinez, a 24-year-old kid from Texas who died when their convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. Major had tried to save him, had detected the explosive but couldn't warn them in time. After Martinez's death, Major suffered what the military veterinarians called canine PTSD. He couldn't bond with new handlers, couldn't perform his duties reliably. They retired him early, Dr. Harrison explained. Gave him to a veteran family in Colorado, but it didn't work out. The dog was too traumatized, too aggressive. Eventually, he ended up as a stray, probably abandoned when his new family couldn't handle his issues. I thought about the scars on Major's body, the way he flinched at sudden movements, his initial distrust of humans. This wasn't just a dog who'd been hit by a car. This was a wounded warrior carrying the weight of combat trauma, just like too many of the boys I'd served with in Vietnam. Dr. Harrison, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What's Major been trying to tell us about Dot? His expression grew grave. Sam, I think you know the answer to that question. I drove home in a daze, Major's service record burning a hole in my jacket pocket. When I walked through our front door, Dot was sitting in her chair, working on that church quilt again, coughing every few minutes like clockwork. She looked up at me with those tired eyes, and I could see she was waiting for me to finally be the husband she deserved. Dot, I said, kneeling beside her chair the way I had when I proposed 50 years ago. We need to talk. That afternoon, Major showed up again, just like he had dozens of times before. But this time, instead of calling the Petersons, I opened the front door and let him in. He walked straight to Dot, placed his massive head on her lap, and looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen too much war and too much pain. "Hello, old boy," she said, stroking his head. "Sam told me about you, about what you've been trying to do." I called Dr. Min Patterson's office and made an appointment for the next morning. When I explained the urgency, mentioned Major's detection training, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Bring her in first thing," the receptionist said. "Dr. Patterson will work her into the schedule." That night, Major stayed with us. He positioned himself beside Dot's side of the bed like a furry guardian angel. And every time she'd cough, he'd lift his head and look at me with an expression that seemed to say, "I told you so." The tests confirmed what Major had been trying to tell us for months. Stage 2 lung cancer. Caught early enough for treatment, but advanced enough to be serious. Dr. Patterson's face was grim when he delivered the news. But there was hope in his voice, too. "If we'd waited another 6 months," he said, we'd be having a very different conversation, but caught at this stage with aggressive treatment. The prognosis is good. As we sat in that sterile hospital room, absorbing the weight of the diagnosis, I kept thinking about Major. A dog I'd found bleeding on the side of the road had potentially saved my wife's life, and I'd been too proud and scared to listen to him. "How did you know?" I asked Dr. Patterson. "How did that dog know cancer cells give off unique chemical signatures?" He explained. "Dogs can detect these scents in concentrations far below what any machine can measure. Military and police dogs are trained to use this ability, but it's actually instinctive for many dogs." Dot reached over and squeezed my hand. He was trying to take care of me. "Sam, just like you've been trying to take care of me by pretending nothing was wrong." The guilt hit me like a freight train. "Dot, I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have insisted you see a doctor months ago." "We both were scared," she said with that gentle wisdom that had gotten us through 50 years of marriage. "But we're going to fight this together. And we're going to win." That evening, when Michael Peterson came by to collect Major, I met him at the front door with a decision that had been building in my heart all day. "Michael, I need to ask you something," I said. "Would you consider letting Major stay with us for a while? Dot's going to be starting cancer treatment, and I think he might be able to help." Michael's face showed understanding. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Truth is, Major's always seemed happier here anyway. Kids will miss him, but they understand." As I watched Michael drive away without Major, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not just for Dot's recovery, but for the possibility that an old soldier and an old dog might be able to help each other heal from the wounds that war leaves on the soul. Major seemed to understand that his mission had changed. He was no longer trying to alert us to danger. Now he was providing comfort and support. During Dot's chemotherapy sessions, he'd lie beside her hospital bed, his steady presence giving her strength. When the treatments made her sick, he'd stay close, offering the kind of unconditional love that humans spend their whole lives trying to perfect. "You know," Dot said one evening as Major slept at her feet, "I think God sent us this dog for a reason. Not just to save my life, but to teach us something about faith and perseverance." Looking at Major, this wounded warrior who'd found his way to our family through pain and loss, I couldn't help but agree. Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he sends help in the form of a retired military dog who refuses to give up on the people he's chosen to protect. We both served our country, Major and I, just in different wars, and now we were serving each other, united by a shared understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the healing power of never giving up on those you love. The night that nearly took everything from me started like any other August evening in Montana, hot, dry, and electric, with the promise of a summer storm. Dot had been in remission for 8 months by then, her cancer treatment successful thanks to Major's early detection. We'd settled into a comfortable routine morning walks with Major, afternoon visits to the garden where Dot was regaining her strength, and quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the Rockies. Becky was back at veterinary school for her final year, and the house felt peaceful in that way only empty nesters understand. Major had claimed his spot as the third member of our household, sleeping at the foot of our bed and following Dot around like a furry shadow, still protective but more relaxed now that the immediate danger had passed. That particular evening, dark clouds had been building on the horizon all day, the kind of towering thunderheads that promise either relief from the heat or trouble from the sky. The Weather Service had issued warnings about dry lightning, the kind of electrical storms that start forest fires, but we'd lived through dozens of them over the years. "Storm's coming," I told Dot as we watched the lightning dance across the distant mountains. "Might lose power." She nodded, gathering up her knitting. "I'll get the candles ready. And Sam, maybe you should check on that old generator in the basement. Haven't used it since last winter." The generator was a cantankerous old beast I'd bought at an Army surplus sale 15 years back. Military grade, built to run field hospitals, but temperamental as a spoiled child. I'd been meaning to have it serviced, but like most things on an old man's to-do list, it kept getting pushed aside. Around 9 o'clock, the storm hit with a vengeance. Rain came down in sheets, turning our gravel driveway into a rushing creek. Lightning cracked overhead like artillery fire, close enough to make the house shake and set Major pacing nervously through the rooms. Then, with a final crash of thunder that sounded like the world splitting open, everything went dark. "Power's out," I called to Dot, though it was obvious enough. The whole valley had gone black except for the occasional flash of lightning, illuminating the landscape like a war zone. I made my way to the basement with a flashlight, cursing under my breath as I navigated the steep wooden stairs. The generator sat in the corner like a sleeping metal beast, and it took 3 pulls of the starter cord before it rumbled to life. Not the smoothest operation, but good enough to keep our refrigerator running and give us some lights. What I didn't know, what I was too trusting and too complacent to check, was that the electrical connections in our 70-year-old house weren't designed to handle the surge from that military generator. Somewhere in the walls, old wiring was heating up, insulation was smoldering, and a fire was beginning to eat its way through the bones of our home. Dot and I went to bed around 10:30. Listening to the rain hammering the roof and the generator chugging away in the basement like a mechanical heartbeat. Major settled into his usual spot at the foot of the bed, but I noticed he seemed restless, getting up and walking to the window, then lying back down, then getting up again. "What's got into you, boy?" I asked him, but he just looked at me with those intelligent eyes and whined softly. I should have paid attention. After everything we'd been through, everything he'd taught us about listening to his warnings, I should have known that Major's restlessness meant danger. But I was tired, comfortable, and foolishly confident that we were safe in our own home. I woke up to the smell of smoke, not the pleasant wood smoke from a fireplace, but the acrid chemical smell of burning electrical components and old insulation. My eyes snapped open in the darkness, and I could see an orange glow flickering under our bedroom door. "Dot." I shook her shoulder, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Dot, wake up. There's a fire." She came awake instantly, the way people do when real danger threatens. "Oh my God, Sam, the smoke." The hallway outside our bedroom was already thick with smoke, and I could hear the crackling sound of flames eating their way through the walls. The fire had started somewhere near the electrical panel and spread through the house's old wiring faster than I would have thought possible. "The front door," I said. But when I looked down the hallway, I could see flames blocking our path. The back door was worse. The kitchen was already engulfed, orange light dancing across the ceiling like demons celebrating. We were trapped. Dot started coughing, the smoke aggravating her lungs that were still fragile from months of chemotherapy. Each cough sounded like a gunshot in the growing roar of the fire, and I could see panic starting to set in. "The window," I said, moving toward the bedroom window that faced our backyard. But it was a 12-foot drop to concrete steps, and Dot was in no condition for that kind of fall. That's when I heard it, a sound that cut through the noise of the fire like a bugle call, the deep, commanding bark of a German shepherd, coming from somewhere outside the house. Major. But Major was supposed to be at the Petersons' place. We'd taken him there that afternoon because of the storm warnings, not wanting him to be frightened by the thunder and lightning. How could he possibly be here? The barking grew more urgent, more insistent, and I could hear scratching at what sounded like the front door. Then came a crash, the sound of wood splintering, and suddenly Major was inside the house, barking commands like a drill sergeant rallying his troops. He appeared in our bedroom doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange glow of the fire. Without hesitation, he ran to Dot's side of the bed and began nudging her toward the floor, his military training taking over. "Follow him," I told Dot, though I had no idea where he was trying to lead us. "Trust him." Major guided us out of the bedroom, not toward the blocked hallway, but toward the bathroom. At first, I thought he was confused. The bathroom had no exit, just a small window that was too high and too narrow for escape. But then I remembered something from my Army days. Something about staying low in smoky buildings, about finding the safest air. The bathroom was like a pocket of breathable air in a house filling with deadly smoke. Major positioned himself between us and the door, his body creating a barrier against the worst of the heat and fumes. "Sam," Dot gasped, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. I can't breathe." Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue from the smoke inhalation. The cancer treatments had left her lungs vulnerable, and I could see her strength fading with each labored breath. That's when Major did something that still gives me chills to think about. He left us for a moment, disappearing into the smoke-filled hallway, and returned carrying something in his mouth. Dot's portable oxygen tank from her cancer treatment days. The tank was small, designed for mobility during treatment, but it held enough oxygen to make the difference between life and death. Major dropped it at Dot's feet and looked at me with an expression that seemed to say, "Use this." And with shaking hands, I connected the nasal cannula and placed it over Dot's nose. The oxygen helped immediately, giving her the strength to stay conscious, to keep fighting. But we were still trapped. The fire was growing stronger, and I could hear the ceiling starting to groan under the stress of the heat. We had minutes, maybe less, before the whole structure came down on top of us. Major barked once, sharply, then moved toward the bathroom door. When I hesitated, he came back and grabbed my sleeve in his teeth, pulling me toward the hallway with the same determination he'd once used to lead soldiers away from roadside bombs. The hallway was an inferno, but Major seemed to know something I didn't. Instead of heading toward either exit, he led us toward the basement stairs, the last place I would have thought to go in a house fire. "Major, no," I started to say, but he was already moving, his body low to the ground where the air was clearest, leading us down into what I was sure would be our tomb. The basement was filled with smoke, but the air was cooler, more breathable, and there, In the far corner where my grandfather had built a root cellar during the Depression was a space that the fire hadn't reached yet. Major led us into that small, stone-walled room and positioned himself at the entrance like a guardian. The thick stone walls provided insulation from the heat, and the small space trapped what clean air remained. We huddled there in the darkness, listening to our house burn above us, while Major stood watch at the door. Every few minutes, he'd venture out to check the basement, then return to us with reports that only he could understand. "That dog came through hell and high water for us," I whispered to Dot as we waited for rescue. 20 minutes later, we heard the sirens. Sitting here now in my study, 3 years after that fire, I need to tell you the deepest truth about why I gave Major away in the first place. It wasn't about him needing a younger family with more energy, though that's what I told everyone, including myself for the longest time. The real reason cuts deeper than I've ever admitted to another living soul. I gave Major away because I was ashamed that a 74-year-old man who'd served his country in Vietnam, who'd raised 3 children and built a life with his bare hands, needed help from a dog to take care of his own wife. Ashamed that I couldn't see what was right in front of my nose, that Dot was dying by inches while I pretended everything was fine. You have to understand, men of my generation were raised to be strong, silent, self-sufficient. We didn't ask for help, didn't show weakness, didn't admit when we were scared or lost or overwhelmed. We were supposed to be the protectors, the providers, the ones who had all the answers. But Major made me feel small. Every time he'd show up at our house, every time he'd hover around Dot with that worried expression, every time he'd whimper when she coughed, he was showing me what I was too proud and too frightened to see. He was being the husband I should have been. Attentive, protective, unwilling to ignore the signs that something was terribly wrong. The truth is, I'd been struggling with my own demons long before Major came into our lives. Vietnam had left scars on my soul that I'd never properly dealt with, never talked about, never admitted existed. I'd come home from that war and buried the memories deep, the way men were expected to do back then. I'd built a life on top of those buried memories, and for 50 years, it had worked well enough. But as I got older, as I watched friends and neighbors succumb to age and illness, those old fears started bubbling to the surface. The fear of helplessness I'd felt in the jungle, pinned down by enemy fire with nowhere to run. The fear of watching good men die while I survived. The fear that maybe I wasn't as strong or as capable as everyone believed me to be. When Major started showing those protective behaviors around Dot, it triggered something in me that I wasn't prepared to face. Here was this dog, this wounded warrior who'd seen his own share of combat, doing the job I was supposed to be doing. He was the one paying attention, the one sounding the alarm, the one refusing to give up even when the humans around him were too stubborn or too scared to listen. And that made me feel like a failure, so I convinced myself that giving him away was the right thing to do. I told myself he needed space to run, children to play with, a family that could give him the attention he deserved. But the real reason was that I couldn't stand the daily reminder of my own inadequacy, couldn't bear to look into those intelligent brown eyes and see the courage I was lacking. The night of the fire, when Major appeared out of nowhere to save our lives, all those buried feelings came crashing down on me like a house of cards in a hurricane. Here was a dog who'd traveled 4 miles through a thunderstorm, who'd broken into a burning house, who'd risked his life to save the people who'd abandoned him. And he did it not because he was trained to, not because he expected anything in return, but because love and loyalty meant more to him than pride or self-preservation. That's when I finally understood what I'd really lost when I gave Major away. It wasn't just a dog. It was the chance to learn something about humility, about accepting help when you need it, about the difference between weakness and vulnerability. In the military, we had a saying, "Pride goeth before the fall." I'd heard it 1,000 times, but I'd never really understood what it meant until I was sitting in that root cellar, breathing through an oxygen tank that a dog had carried to save my wife's life. Major wasn't trying to make me feel small. He was trying to make me better. He was showing me what real strength looks like, not the ability to handle everything alone, but the wisdom to recognize when you need help, and the humility to accept it. After the fire department pulled us out of that basement, after the paramedics checked us over, and the fire chief shook his head at the miracle of our survival, I sat on the bumper of an ambulance with Major beside me and finally admitted the truth to myself. "I'm sorry, boy," I whispered into his fur as he leaned against my leg. "I'm sorry I was too proud to listen. I'm sorry I let my ego get in the way of doing right by you and Dot." Major just looked at me with those patient brown eyes, his tail wagging slowly like he was saying, "Apology accepted, old man. Now let's move forward." But my confession wasn't complete yet. I still hadn't told Dot the real reason I'd given Major away. Still hadn't admitted to her that my decision had been based on wounded pride rather than the dog's best interests. That conversation happened 3 days later, after we'd moved into a temporary apartment while insurance adjusters assessed the damage to our home. "Sam," Dot said one morning over coffee, "I know why you really gave Major to the Petersons." My heart nearly stopped. "You do. You felt like he was showing you up, like he was better at taking care of me than you were." She reached across the table and took my weathered hand in hers. "Honey, I've been married to you for 50 years. I know when you're wrestling with pride." I started to deny it, started to give her the same story about Major needing a younger family, but the words died in my throat. After everything we'd been through, after nearly losing her to cancer and both of us to the fire, I owed her the truth. "You're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was ashamed that a dog could see what I was too blind or too scared to see. I felt like he was making me look like a fool. Dot squeezed my hand. "Sam Whitmore, you've been taking care of me for half a century. One dog with special training doesn't diminish that. If anything, Major was trying to help you keep taking care of me." "I know that now," I said. "But back then, all I could see was my own failure." "Well," she said with that gentle smile that had been melting my heart since 1973, "maybe it's time you forgave yourself for being human. Lord knows Major already has." Looking back now, I realized that giving Major away was the act of a frightened old man clinging to outdated notions of pride and self-sufficiency. But his return, his refusal to abandon us even after we'd abandoned him, taught me something about the kind of love that doesn't keep score, doesn't hold grudges, and doesn't let pride get in the way of doing what's right. Sometimes it takes a dog to teach an old man new tricks, and sometimes the hardest lesson to learn is that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom. Now comes the revelation that knocked me sideways harder than a 2x4 to the head. 3 days after the fire, when we were staying at the Copper Ridge Inn while the insurance folks sorted through the ashes of our home, Michael Peterson showed up at our door with a confession that changed everything I thought I knew about the last 4 years. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and Major at his side. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." I invited him in, figuring he wanted to talk about Major's heroic rescue, or maybe offer help with our situation. Instead, he sat down across from me at the small table in our temporary quarters and said words that made the world tilt on its axis. "My name isn't really Peterson, sir. It's Whitmore. Michael Samuel Whitmore." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm your son." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Dot's coffee cup clinked against the saucer as her hand began to tremble, and Major whined softly from his spot by the door, sensing the tension in the room. "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I was studying his face, the familiar blue eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way he rubbed his left temple when he was nervous, just like I did. I was born Michael Samuel Whitmore in Denver, Colorado, on March 15th, 1978. He continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "My mother was Linda Sue Morrison. You two were married for 8 months before you shipped out to Vietnam in 1968. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting, memories I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself they weren't real. Linda, barely 18, pregnant and terrified. Me, 19 and just as scared, trying to do the right thing by marrying her before I left for Southeast Asia. The letters that stopped coming, the divorce papers that reached me in a field hospital outside Saigon. Linda remarried when I was 2, Michael continued. Harold Peterson was a good man, gave me his name, raised me like his own. But she told me the truth when I turned 18, about you, about Vietnam, about why you never came back. I felt like I was drowning in shallow water. She told me the lawyer said you'd been adopted, that you didn't want contact. I was 8 years old. Dad, I didn't even know what contact meant. Michael's voice carried decades of hurt, but also something else, a tentative hope. When Harold Peterson died 5 years ago, I started looking for you. Found out you'd settled here in Copper Ridge, married Dorothy, built a good life. Dot reached over and took my hand, her touch grounding me in the moment. "How long have you known who Sam was?" she asked Michael. "Since before we took Major," he admitted. "Sarah figured it out first. She's always been good at connecting dots. When we heard through the church about the German shepherd that needed a home, she said it was a sign, a way to be close to you without forcing a confrontation neither of us might be ready for." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. "So, when you agreed to take Major, we were hoping he might bridge the gap somehow, give us a reason to see each other, to start building something." Michael looked down at his hands. "But then, Major kept coming back to you, and we realized he was trying to tell us something more important than family reconciliation." "You knew," I said. the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. You knew he was trying to warn us about Dot's cancer. Sarah suspected it first. She's a nurse, knows the signs. When Major kept focusing on Mrs. Whitmore, kept showing up here so persistently, she started putting two and two together. Michael's voice grew heavy with guilt. We should have said something sooner. Should have insisted you get her checked out. But we didn't know how to approach you without revealing who we were. The weight of missed opportunities, of years lost to pride and fear and misunderstanding, settled on my chest like a stone. Here was my son, living just 20 miles away, watching from a distance while his stepchildren unknowingly played with their step-grandfather's dog. The twins, I said suddenly. Jake and Lucy. Your grandchildren, Michael confirmed. They've been asking about you since the fire, wanting to know if Grandpa Sam was okay. Sarah finally told them the truth yesterday. I thought about those two bright-faced 12-year-olds, how they'd taken to Major so easily, how they'd reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. Now I knew what it was. They had the same mischievous sparkle in their eyes that Michael had shown in the few baby pictures Linda had sent me before the letters stopped coming. Why now? Dot asked gently. Why tell us now? Michael looked at Major, who was watching our conversation with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand every word. Because that dog risked his life to save you both. Because after everything that's happened, keeping secrets seems like the worst kind of sin. And because, his voice broke slightly, because I realized I might lose the chance to have a real father if I kept waiting for the perfect moment. The silence stretched between us. 43 years of separation and misunderstanding hanging in the air like smoke. I looked at this man, my son, who'd grown up without me, who'd built a good life despite my absence, who'd found a way to stay connected even when I didn't know he existed. I tried to find you, I said finally, my voice rough with emotion. After I came back from Vietnam, I tried to contact Linda, but the lawyers said it was better for everyone if I stayed away. I know, Michael said. Mom told me. She said you were dealing with your own demons then, trying to put your life back together. Maybe it was better that way. Maybe we both needed time to become the men we are now before we could handle being father and son. Dot was crying openly now. Tears of joy mixed with sorrow for all the lost years. Does this mean we have a family again? She asked. Michael smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from him since he'd walked through our door. Sarah's been cooking your favorite meal for 3 days, according to the church ladies who've been comparing notes. The twins have been practicing calling you Grandpa and Grandma instead of Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. And Major... He looked down at the dog, who was now lying with his head on my feet. Major's been trying to bring this family together since the day you found him. That's when it hit me, the full magnitude of what had happened. Major hadn't just saved our lives from cancer and fire. He'd been weaving our broken family back together, thread by thread, visit by visit, crisis by crisis. A dog who'd lost his own military family had somehow found a way to heal ours. Well, I said, standing up on shaky legs and extending my hand to my son, I guess we've got 43 years of catching up to do. Michael stood too, but instead of taking my hand, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in the kind of embrace I'd been missing without even knowing it. as I held my son for the first time since he was a baby. I felt Major lean against both our legs, his tail wagging slowly, like he was saying, "Mission accomplished." Sometimes God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he uses a wounded warrior with 4 legs and a heart bigger than the Montana sky to bring his children home. 6 months later, as I sit here in our rebuilt home with Major sleeping at my feet, I can finally see the whole picture of what that old dog accomplished in the years he shared our lives. It's a story of redemption that goes far beyond one family, far beyond one town, and speaks to something eternal about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Major lived with us full time after the fire, and those final months were perhaps the sweetest of our long marriage. Dot's health remained strong, her cancer in complete remission, monitored regularly by both Dr. Patterson and Major's ever-watchful nose. Every Sunday, our house filled with the laughter of children as Michael's family joined us for dinner, creating new traditions to replace the years we'd lost. Jake and Lucy took to calling us Grandpa Sam and Grandma Dot as naturally as breathing, and watching them play with Major in our rebuilt backyard brought a joy I hadn't felt since my own children were small. The dog seemed to understand his role as family patriarch, patient with the twins' endless energy, protective but gentle, always ready for a game of fetch or a quiet moment of companionship. "You know," Dot said one evening as we watched Major teaching Jake how to properly throw a ball, "I think that dog's been running a long-term operation none of us fully understood." She was right. Major hadn't just detected Dot's cancer or saved us from the fire. He'd been systematically healing our family, bringing together pieces that had been scattered by time, pride, and misunderstanding. Every escape from the Peterson farm, every insistent visit to our house, every worried whimper around Dot had been part of a larger mission only he seemed to understand. Becky graduated from veterinary school that spring and came home to work alongside Dr. Harrison. Her first order of business was establishing something she called Major's Program, an initiative to train dogs for medical detection and to help retired military working dogs find civilian families. "Grandpa," she said during one of our Sunday dinners, "Major's story could help so many other families. There are hundreds of retired military dogs who need homes, and thousands of families who could benefit from their training and loyalty." The program started small, with Becky working with the local VFW post to connect veterans' families with retired service dogs, but word spread quickly, and soon we were getting calls from across the state. Major became something of a celebrity. His story featured in the Billings Gazette and eventually picked up by national news outlets. "Hero Dog Saves Family That Saved Him," read the headline in USA Today. But those of us who knew Major understood that the real story was more complex, more beautiful than any newspaper could capture. He wasn't just a hero. He was a teacher, showing all of us what unconditional love really meant. The recognition brought visitors to our little town, families seeking their own second chances with retired military dogs. The Copper Ridge Inn started hosting Major's weekend events, where potential adoptive families could meet available dogs and learn about the unique needs of former military working animals. But for all the attention and accolades, Major remained focused on his primary mission, taking care of our family. As autumn approached, I noticed he was slowing down. At 10 years old, the combined toll of his combat service and the injuries from his accident were beginning to show. His morning walks became shorter, his afternoon naps longer, and sometimes I'd catch him just sitting quietly, looking out at the mountains with an expression of peaceful contentment. He's tired, Sam. Dr. Harrison told me during Major's regular checkup. His heart's strong, and there's no immediate crisis. But he's an old soldier who's carried a heavy load for a long time. He's earned his rest. One October evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the peaks of the Rockies, Major didn't come when Dot called him for dinner. We found him in his favorite spot in the backyard, lying peacefully under the apple tree where he'd spent countless hours watching over our rebuilt life. His breathing was shallow but steady, and when I knelt beside him, he lifted his great head and looked at me with those wise brown eyes one last time. There was no fear there, no pain, just the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. "Thank you, old boy," I whispered, stroking his graying muzzle. "Thank you for teaching us all how to come home." Michael and Sarah arrived within the hour, bringing Jake and Lucy, who understood without being told that their four-legged grandfather was saying goodbye. We sat with him as the sun set behind the mountains, taking turns telling him what he'd meant to us, how he'd changed our lives, how grateful we were for his stubborn, persistent love. Major passed peacefully in his sleep that night, surrounded by the family he'd worked so hard to heal and unite. When the morning came, there was a sense of completion rather than loss, as if a great work had been finished exactly as it was meant to be. We buried Major in the Copper Ridge Veterans Cemetery, with full military honors provided by the local VFW post. His headstone, made of Montana granite, reads simply, "Major Rex, faithful servant, teacher, family." The American flag that draped his coffin was folded with the same precision given to any fallen soldier and presented to Dot, who keeps it in a place of honor in our living room. The memorial service drew people from across the state, veterans who understood the special bond between soldiers and their dogs, families who'd been touched by Major's program, neighbors who'd watched our story unfold over the years. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from Jake, who stood before the crowd and said, "Major taught us that love isn't just about the time you spend with someone. It's about never giving up on them, even when they give up on you." In the months since Major's passing, his legacy has continued to grow. Major's program has placed over 200 retired military dogs with veteran families across Montana and Wyoming. The Copper Ridge Veterans Center now includes a wing dedicated to animal-assisted therapy, where dogs and veterans help heal each other's invisible wounds. Becky has written a book about Major's story, with all proceeds going to fund the program that bears his name. "Some Angels Wear Fur Coats and Wag Their Tails" became a bestseller, spreading Major's message of loyalty, forgiveness, and second chances to readers across the country. But for our family, Major's greatest gift wasn't fame or recognition. It was showing us that love multiplies when it's shared freely, without conditions or expectations. He taught an old soldier that accepting help isn't weakness but wisdom, that pride is a poor substitute for connection, and that sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other. This past Christmas, Michael surprised us with a puppy, a German shepherd from the same bloodline as Major. Little Rex, as the twins named him, has already shown signs of the intelligence and loyalty that marked his predecessor. As I watch him playing in the same yard where Major once stood guard, learning the same lessons about family and responsibility, I'm reminded that love doesn't end with death. It continues, passed down from one generation to the next like a precious inheritance. That old dog taught this old dog new tricks about forgiveness, about swallowing pride for the sake of love. about the healing power of truth-telling. He showed us that God sometimes sends help in unexpected forms, that miracles can wear fur coats and respond to simple commands like stay and come home. As I finish this story, sitting in the same chair where I began it, I can hear Rex playing with the grandchildren in the backyard, their laughter mixing with Dot's humming as she works in her kitchen. Our house is full again, full of life, full of love, full of the kind of joy that comes from understanding what really matters. Major Rex taught us all how to come home, and in doing so, he found his own way to immortality, not in monuments or medals, but in the lives he touched, the families he healed, and the love he multiplied simply by refusing to give up on the people he'd chosen to protect. That's what we used to call American spirit. And some angels do indeed wear fur coats and wag their tails. Sometimes life teaches us that love doesn't ask for permission to transform everything we thought we knew about family, loyalty, and second chances. Major's story reminds us that the greatest gifts often come disguised as burdens, and the deepest healing happens when we finally find the courage to let others help carry our load. For those of us who've lived long enough to understand that pride can be our greatest enemy and humility our truest strength, this old dog's lesson rings especially true. We've all made mistakes, pushed away help when we needed it most, let fear masquerade as independence, missed opportunities to say, "I love you," or "I'm sorry," because we thought we had unlimited time. But Major proved that it's never too late to come home, never too late to rebuild bridges we thought were permanently burned, never too late to choose love over pride. His unwavering loyalty in the face of abandonment, his refusal to give up on the people who'd given up on him, shows us what unconditional love really looks like. In a world that often feels cold and disconnected, stories like this remind us that faithfulness still exists, that miracles still happen, and that sometimes the most profound love comes on four legs with a wagging tail. Share your thoughts. Have you ever had an animal in your life that taught you something profound about love or loyalty? What second chance are you most grateful for in your own life? Please leave a comment below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.